This is the greatest comic of all time, and if you disagree with me, that's fine, but here's what I'm gonna give you. A blank sandwich with extra knuckles. That's right, the greatest comic ever is not Watchmen, it's not Planetary, it's not Immortal Hulk, it's not Uncanny X-Men, it's Bone, the comic that you might remember from Scholastic book fairs of your youth. When I was about 7, I went to a comic store in Detroit called Time Travelers, and I remember they had this comic on their rack, and I'd never heard of it, and my dad had never heard of it, and he had no idea what was in there, so even though it looked super interesting, he wouldn't let me buy it, just in case. And instead, what I ended up buying that day was issue 1 of Spider-Man 2099 for $1, and it's the only comic I've ever given away. But anyway, it wasn't until late 3rd grade, maybe 4th grade, that I discovered Bone in my school library, and I was instantly hooked. And one of the main reasons that I was hooked so quickly is because Jeff Smith, the creator of Bone, had a lot of the same influences growing up that I had. He grew up reading comics like Beetle Bailey, BC, Peanuts, of course, and Mad Comics, especially Spy vs. Spy, all of which were comics that my dad had in his personal collection, so I grew up reading those, and I was very fluent in their language. This issue here is probably the first comic I ever owned for myself. I got it from my dad when I was very young, and it's got a Carl Barks story in it, which is one of the main influences on Jeff Smith. Carl Barks is a legendary animator that worked for Disney, and you can tell that he's got an eye for cartooning by that panel there. Look at that boat being tossed in the waves. That's not typical Saturday morning cartoon type stuff. That is real illustration. So on top of those other cartoons, I was growing up with Disney, Looney Tunes, Underdog, and Super Goof, some of which have not been cited as main influences for Jeff Smith, but they're in that same vein. One of Smith's biggest influences was Pogo by Walt Kelly. This volume from 1951 is one of my most cherished books on my bookshelf, and I don't want to open it up and page through it for you, so we'll take a look at this big old volume of Pogo. And I know what I'm supposed to be doing is finding good high-definition pictures on the internet and then scrolling past them slowly while I talk under them so that you can see the art really well, but I much prefer the scholarly old wizard shtick where I can reach onto my shelf of curiosities and pull down a book and flip through the pages lovingly and say, perhaps this will aid you in your quest, young knight. Or maybe I've just got a lot of cool stuff and I want to share it. So anyway, Pogo is a classic cartoon that takes place in the Louisiana Bayou. It follows a bunch of animal characters in this basically magical swamp forest doing their, cartoony mishaps. A lot of the characters and the speaking styles in Bone are direct references to Pogo. It's really just a seminal work of cartooning. Top-notch stuff Pogo is. It's got so much heart in it, and so much adventure, and so much humor. I wholeheartedly recommend it. Another big influence on Jeff Smith was Popeye, and if you haven't read his Thimble Theater adventures, they are golden. One of the reasons Popeye stands out is because E.C. Seeger, who created Thimble Theater, had long continuous stories that would only do about 4 panels at a time, but every day you'd come back for the next installment of that story. And the Popeye stories went on way longer than any other cartoon at the time. Sometimes other cartoons would do 3 or 4 strips in a row, but they would never come close to what Seeger did with his Thimble Theater Popeye adventures. They just went on forever. And I always assumed that Bloom County was a big influence on Bone for the sense of humor and for the way he would draw certain characters, especially his eyelid action that he has on a lot of his characters. But I found out recently that Doonesbury, the comic strip, is actually what had that influence. And I don't own any Doonesbury because it's never really appealed to me. But now that I can see Doonesbury in Bone, I'm gonna go back and read that. So anyway, my point with all these influences that I brought up is to say that he grew up reading the same stuff that I grew up reading. So by the time I found Bone, my little 8-year-old brain was perfectly wired to speak the language that Bone was speaking. It's also worth mentioning that I grew up reading a lot of Calvin and Hobbes, and I grew up in a place where I could just go wandering in the woods for hours and hours at a time and never see anybody if I felt like it. So this sense of sacredness that nature has and the desire to just get lost in the woods is so integral to who I am as a person and how I understand the world, and Bone is fully locked into those ideas. Now, I don't want to seem like one of those Harry Potter kids who needs everybody to know that it's the best series ever because I grew up reading it. It's not just me. Bone has won 10 Eisner Awards, it's won 11 Harvey Awards. In 2004, Time magazine said that it's the best all-ages graphic novel yet published. Not to mention, Will Eisner is one of the guys who got Bone off the ground to begin with. Yeah, the guy that they named the most prestigious comics award after. He gave Bone a glowing recommendation, which is what got it in the hands of retailers, which is what got it in the hands of fans. And by about issue 5, Bone was massive. But it's not as if everything Jeff Smith writes is legendary. It's not like he can do no wrong. His secret weapon for Bone was that he'd been thinking about these characters since he was 5. This is an excerpt from one of the very first Bone comics from 1970. He made it when he was 10, and you can tell he's already got this innate understanding of how to draw things effectively. Just look at this panel where they're being carried by this current through a sewer. That is genius for a 10-year-old. Looking at those old cartoons is a lot like looking at Frank Frazetta's Snowman, which is a cartoon he made when he was 15, and you can tell he already has a better understanding of color than most adults who were working in the industry had at the time. Smith kind of took a break from cartooning once he discovered girls were a thing, which is something that a lot of cartoonists say, but then while he was in college at Ohio State University, he became the cartoonist for their newspaper. And he spent 3 years doing this comic strip called Thorn, which is a great precursor to Bone, where he really has a lot of time to flesh out the characters and the setting. And I'm really upset that I missed the cutoff date for the Kickstarter by like less than a month for a full collection of all the Thorn strips from those 3 years. Oh, I need that on my bookshelf so bad! But that comic strip unfortunately didn't lead to any larger scale syndication for him. He didn't get to publish in any newspapers around the country. So for a while he was an animator, working with a few friends on a company he created, doing freelance work for bigger companies. And this is, I think, where he really learned how to set himself apart from the crowd, because as an animator, he learned not only the importance of exaggerated poses and clear composition, but he further deepened his understanding of moment and movement. Look at this page in Bone. It's the same panel 6 times with the same characters sitting in the same spot, but the way they're drawn has this clear sense of movement, and it's almost like it's a storyboard for an animation. They're drawn with such little differences, but they're very important small differences. Because when you're animating, the economy of line is so important. You don't want to sit there drawing a bunch of details over and over and over that you could get wrong over and over and over. So Smith was getting tons and tons of practice making concise, profound lines that convey tons of information but are easily repeatable. And by the way, his sense of line is just genius. It's clearly inspired by Walt Kelly and Will Eisner. Look at the varying thickness of those lines. There's so much form and depth to these figures. But it's still so simple. Most other artists who have very simple drawings end up with something kind of flat. But not Jeff Smith. He draws simple and effective, and it looks three-dimensional. It pops right off the page. So anyway, that's all pretty much overview stuff. Now, let's take a look under the hood of this baby and see what really makes her run. Bone starts out as a slapstick comic that wears all of its cartoon references on its sleeve. It's very familiar and fun, and you feel like you've known these characters forever right away. Mostly because the characters have had 20 years to really get shaped, so they're so fully formed the second we meet them. We follow Phone Bone and his 2 brothers, Smiley Bone and Phony Bone, as they find themselves in this mystical forest where everything is almost medieval, like the clocks have been turned back. The Bones come from a place which Smith has said is essentially Duckburg. Boneville is never seen, and it's very rarely referenced because Smith doesn't want us to know too much about it. He wants it to seem like a faraway place that we're never going to see. The point is that they come from somewhere modern, and they've stumbled into this backwards forest where everything is old-fashioned. So in the first 2 volumes, it's basically Pogo. There's a bunch of talking animals, a bunch of mishaps, there's a great cow race where Grandma Ben literally races cows on foot, there's cartoon physics, giant talking bugs, the classic recurring stupid rat creatures line. I love the bumbling henchman duo trope. Those 2 idiots who work for the main villain and somehow they get chosen to do every single task even though they're profoundly incompetent, like the 2 demons from Hercules, or the 2 guys from 101 Dalmatians, or the 2 guys from Home Alone. Or my favorite example, even though they aren't technically henchmen, the Thompson twins from Tintin comics. They are hilarious. I love them. And anyway, back to Bone, it also has lots of really funny, quotable moments like, Chuckles wants real eggs! So in these first 2 books, we're just sitting in this magical forest having the time of our lives, laughing our guts out, while also we start to get this kind of undertone of something darker going on, but we're not sure what and we're not sure how it's going to affect us. So we've started in this really fun slapstick place, but by the time we get to the end of book 9, we're going to have basically God herself coming to destroy the world, and the whole planet is at war. And along the way, we're going to deal with themes such as romance, family values, sibling rivalry, greed, abuse of power, good and evil, fear-mongering, fanaticism, mythology, spirituality, and of course, war. So we read the story from the perspective of Bone, who is basically an everyman, and he doesn't know what's going on, he's just trying to be polite and figure things out. At the beginning of the story, he doesn't really believe these creation myths that people have in this area, but by the end of the story, he's realized, oh yeah, the creation myth is real and it's coming to kill me. But even though Phone Bone is supposed to represent us discovering this world, the real main character who's having all the character development in this story is Thorn. And starting around volume 3 and going through somewhere around volume 6, Thorn discovers the truth of her identity and the world around her and how much deeper these things go than she thought. And even though in book 3 we start to get more serious and we're paving the way for more earth-shattering events in this world, it never stops being hilarious. There's still jokes happening throughout the book and it's never timed wrong. There's never a joke that makes you miss out on the drama of a situation. In fact, the jokes always come at the exact right time to punctuate the life and death situation they're in. Volume 7 is the first Bone comic I ever bought for myself. I saw it in a bookstore at the mall, and I had only ever read volumes 1 through 6 because those were the only ones that have been printed so far. And even though plenty of people will say that volume 7 is one of the most boring volumes in the whole series, mostly because it's one of the least visually interesting, I didn't care, and I don't care, because by the time we got to this point, I would watch these characters do anything. By the time you get to book 6, you are Phone Bone. You care so deeply about all these characters because the slow build from slapstick humor to world-ending disasters is so well done you don't even notice it. It's practically imperceptible. It's so smooth. And by the time you get to book 9, you're basically reading a much funnier, much more accessible version of Lord of the Rings. All the main characters go through so much character development, and all of them manage to tie everything up so satisfyingly at the end of book 9. Characters like Grandma Ben, who seems borderline senile, she's the crazy old cow lady when you meet her, by the end of the book is commanding a giant army like any seasoned war general. But it's not out of nowhere. The transition from crazy old cow lady to war general is so smooth and believable. The character Lucius Down, who provides a great comedic foil to Phony Bone, who also seems to be deeply troubled for reasons we don't quite understand at the beginning of the book, is eventually revealed to be struggling with guilt and has the chance to regain his honor and prove his loyalty all the way at the end of the book. Even minor characters like Bartleby are so well crafted that even though he was meant to be a throwaway character that only lasted for one of the books, ended up being so popular that Jeff Smith had to bring him back at the end of the book. But one of the strongest examples of character development is definitely Thorn. Now, Thorn is a character based on Jeff Smith's wife, and Thorn is also one of the best examples of female empowerment in the whole comics medium. She starts as an unassuming but still competent farm girl, and discovers that not only is she the lost princess of the valley, but she also has a deep natural connection to the dreaming, which is the spirituality of this book. So throughout the 9 volumes, we slowly see her starting to understand and come to terms with this new identity she has, and she learns more and more about her ability to utilize the dreaming, until eventually she becomes a real force to be reckoned with, almost scary, but definitely very powerful. And in the end, of course, she's instrumental in saving the day, but of course she's a humble hero about it. You can't help but fall in love with her the second you see her, just like Phone Bone did, and by the end of the book you have so much admiration for who this character is. It doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel preachy, it just manages to magically touch on that profound sense of what life is. So anyway, the story is amazing, and I could go on and on and on about all my favorite characters throughout, and all my favorite tropes, and all my favorite quotable moments in there, but a great story isn't what makes it the greatest comic of all time. It also needs to have amazing artwork. And like I said before, his experience as an animator makes his cartoon panels really easy to read, and all the expressions and body language is super clear, but he also has these great world-building pages that are so clear, and there's so much depth to the composition. A fantasy epic is nothing without world building, and he builds this world so vividly. And part of the reason he can build this world so vividly is because Jeff Smith literally grew up going to this place. I didn't know this until I was 20, but Old Man's Cave is a real place inside Hocking Hills State Park in Ohio, which is like 4 hours from me. And you might not expect somewhere like Ohio to have beautiful valley-type scenery like hills and giant rocks and big old gnarled trees and caves and whatnot, but there it is. These are pictures from Hocking Hills directly next to the artwork that was inspired by this place. Here's our establishing shot of Old Man's Cave in Bone. And here's a picture I took of my girlfriend standing in the exact same spot in the real Old Man's Cave. Here's a direct comparison for the cover of the book I've been showing you next to the actual photo reference that he took in Hocking Hills. And I have tried so hard to find that spot so that I can remake that photo with myself in it. And this is the closest that I've got. I know it's not the right thing, but it's close. Ish. I love going to Hocking Hills. It's one of my favorite places, especially because it's directly connected to my favorite comic book of all time. But you shouldn't go. It's not fun. You shouldn't go there, because I don't want to share. And it's not just the beautiful scenery that he does so well, and it's not just the great poses and expressions that he does so well. Here's a few other excellent pages of art that prove that Jeff Smith is one of the greatest cartoonists of all time. Here's the Great Red Dragon in a dream sequence. Look at those seagulls and the way that he draws that wave. This moment where Smiley sends these three flying off a cliff in their little cart, and you can hear the way that they're falling through the air. This moment when Grandma Ben reveals that she's the queen of the valley, and you can feel the power in this panel. I think about this panel a lot, the one where the Great Red Dragon was just freed and rat creatures showed up, and he's just smoking, ready to annihilate these guys. Here's an old rat creature temple that I think is illustrated beautifully. Jeff Smith drew a lot of inspiration from Indian architecture, and you can really see that in these kind of pictures. Here's another panel I think about really often. Look at the way this panel is drawn. There's like minimal line. The economy of line is so purposeful here, but you can still tell that there's a giant forest behind them. You can tell that those are mountains even farther back, and you can practically feel the grass blowing in the wind that she's running through. This establishing shot where the bones are wandering through this dripping wet foliage, and we got the rat creatures lurking is so scary. Here's something subtle that's done really well. Look at the difference between Grandma Ben's face in these two panels. In that first one, she's thinking. She's clearly just figuring out her options. And in that second one, the determination has set in. And the actual pose has barely changed, but the mood is tremendously different. This double-page spread blew my mind when I read it for the first time. Let me see if I can find this in color. There it is. Talk about Lord of the Rings. This battle is so vivid. You can hear it. You can taste the metal in the air. Here's a really powerful shot that I think about a lot. You can see the bones coming up with this history that they've been disregarding for so long, but now they're finally understanding the power of it and how far back all of this goes. And you can feel that in this giant picture that's mostly empty white space. And I'm showing you all these pictures in black and white because that's how Smith intended for it to be read. It wasn't until Scholastic contacted him about publishing the color versions that he even considered it. Smith was definitely on the same train of thought as his contemporaries like Frank Miller with Sin City and Dave Sim with Cerebus, which has a lot of parallels between Bone. I love Cerebus deeply. I've only read the first volume here so far because I want to wait until I have all of the phone book volumes, and then I'm just going to read all of them. But anyway, back to Bone. Look at this great establishing shot that has really good setting work, but also this picture of Rockjaw has stuck with me forever because that is the face of a cat stalking its prey. That cat has one thought on its mind: find its prey. And it's so well done and so simple. He makes it look so easy. Look at this panel of the giant phony bone balloon coming out of the mist. That is a powerful image. Sometimes we would get these rare treats where he really goes into detail, especially in dream sequences, and he would just do this painstaking rendering. And having them so rarely didn't make them stick out and feel like they didn't belong there. It really just made those moments stick out as important, like something you have to remember because this is what the story is all about. And one of the last pages I want to show you is this awesome pillar of smoke and lightning that we get in book 7. Even in black and white, there's nowhere near the level of detail that like John Byrne would put into something like this, but it is so powerful and it reads so easily. All of these little tags are moments that I wanted to show you that I think are just so well done, but I don't have enough time to go through all of them. My point is, Bone is a masterpiece. I don't just love it because I grew up with it. I don't just love it because it had a lot of the same influences that I had growing up. I love it because it has so much heart. It has so much wisdom. It has so much adventure, so much humor, so much epic proportion to it. It is so addicting to read. But it's also accessible. It's marketed for kids because they can understand it. It's a great place for children to learn things about love and fear and loss without being overwhelmed by gritty details. But if you're an adult and you're saying, I don't want to read a children's book now that I'm in my 30s or whatever, don't worry, because this book is still a masterclass in storytelling. So if you haven't read it, do yourself a favor and just get lost in this world. It is a beautiful place. The world building was 20 years in preparation, and you can tell. Just get lost in it. And if you have read it, frick, I don't know, read it again. Maybe point out in the comments your favorite thing about it that I forgot to mention because I have very limited time. So in conclusion, Bone is a 10 out of 10 graphic novel. It's the best comic I've ever read. It's the comic that I rate all other comics against. And yes, it's better than Watchmen. If you haven't seen my other videos, really the goal of this channel is to review comics, and what I want to do is take new comics that most people don't know about and give them a promotion bump when they deserve to be read by people. Really good storytelling often doesn't get a boost from Will Eisner himself, so that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to catapult good art into the mainstream, and your subscription and your likes really help that. So go read Bone, go watch my other videos, go buy some comics from your local retailer, and if you read it, let me know what you think.